Sota DAF YOMI SOTA. First impressions, Rasha Arum. So that we continue with this amazing Masechta Sota, which is just full of such deep human psychology, quite apart from all the other Torah that's in it. And here we have one such example of the power of first impressions and assumptions and how to get beyond them. Because the difficulty, as we're going to see, with a first impression or a first assumption, we know the power of first impressions in terms of marketing, in terms of having a meeting, an interview with somebody. We know already how powerful that first impression is, and that you've only got a few seconds in which to make that first impression. And whatever comes afterwards is then rooted in that first impression. So that first impression is very hard to move off. In learning and in thinking, you've also got first impressions. You have an impression, you learn something, and before you've got into it, and before you've gone into the depth of it, you're already forming impressions and you're drawing conclusions. And just as a first impression can't be easily moved off, so a first assumption in learning, when thinking, is hard to move off. As we learned yesterday, that the Torah Tamima's concern with women and other quick-minded people is that they're able to jump to a conclusion which might be a very accurate conclusion very early in the process, but then they lose the whole method, the whole methodology, the process of analysis, of learning, of thinking it through, questioning and answering, debating and discussing, because in their mind it's clear already. Sometimes that initial assumption is wrong. And it's very difficult. I remember Rabbi Meir Soloveitchik saying to me once, trying to discourage me from learning Bekius. That was still in the years when one could even try such a thing, to discourage people to learn Bekius. And he said, you know that when you learn something the first time, it's wrong. You know that. Every time you learn a piece of Gemara, has it ever happened to you that after learning it in depth, you still have the same understanding of it as you had at first? So why do you want to learn daf after daf after daf with wrong ideas? You know it's wrong. If you want to go fast, rather learn Mishnah, Be'iyun, and then you can cover a lot of concepts. Learn Rif, Be'iyun, and then you can cover a lot of concepts. But to learn Gemara Be'iyun, you're simply embedding into your mind misconception. But as we said yesterday, that today that's what people are learning, and that's how people are learning. But one at least has to know the limitations of that we run the risk of becoming attached to an initial understanding of a sugya and not opening our minds to completely overturning that understanding as we move further into it, and to be able to say my initial understanding was completely wrong. The sugya that we're dealing with is built on the posuk in Mishlei, Ani chochma shachanti orma. I am wisdom. Rashi says it's the wisdom of the Torah, and within me is deceit, is slyness. V'dad mezimotim tzah. Says Rashi, etzel orma shekivan shelamad adam Torah nichnas bo armimut shel kol davar. There is a risk in learning. No, learning is not always long. People think as long as you're learning Torah, everything's good. There's a risk in learning Torah. The risk is that with learning Torah, you can become very sly. You know how the halacha works. You know the corners to cut. You know the way a thief thinks and operates. You can learn to be sly, and you can use that slyness. And how many times have we seen that where B'nai Torah, people who are learning, use slyness in their business dealings, and they're thought of as sharp. It's sharp to the point of misleading, because you get very, very good at slyness when you learn. Says Rashi, and that's what Shlomo HaMelech is warning. Be careful with learning. That doesn't mean don't learn. It just means learn carefully and don't become sly. And that's the Rabbi Eliezer in our Gemara on Daf YOMI SOTA, Ko melamed et bito Torah melamdat tiflut. What does it mean that we learned yesterday that if you teach your daughter Torah, you compel her, you force her, as we learned yesterday, you could result in her learning the slyness without learning the truth. My time, where does that come from? That's where Rashi gets it from in Mishlei, from our sugya. That when you learn wisdom, when you learn Torah, there is also a certain slyness that penetrates your mind that you have to be careful of. Which leads the Gemara onto a fascinating question. Heichi dami rasha arum. That means you could have somebody who is wicked in his slyness, but he's a Talmid Chacham. He can learn. We have to be open to that possibility and not stereotype Talmidei Chachomim into thinking they're tzaddikim. They are tzaddikim and they're Talmidei Chachomim. And the best is when you get a Talmid Chacham is a tzaddik. That's incredible. But not every Talmid Chacham is a tzaddik. You can have a Talmid Chacham who is a sly thief. But he knows Shas. There's no guarantee, particularly if he's learnt in this particular way. Zeh hamat'im dvarav l'dayam kodim sheyavo baldin chavero. What is a rasha arum? Such a person that we're talking about, who has become sly through his learning, and that leads him to wickedness, is a person who has a din Torah, he has a court case with the dayan, and he puts his case before the other person is even present. Asks the Netziv, how's that possible? Kasheli, hech dayan, hech shama mimenu. Kasheli, hi dayan, hech shama mimenu. How did the dayan listen to him? Every dayan knows it's in the rule books. The first thing a dayan learns is you don't listen to one unless the other's present, and you listen to them both at the same time. Where's the slyness here? Don't we know there's a pasuk in the Ten Commandments, Lo tisash ma'ashav. And what is Lo tisash ma'ashav? Rashi says, firstly it means don't accept Lashon Hara. We just translate Lo tishma Shem shav, don't take God's name in vain. That's not what it means. Lo tishma Shem shav means don't accept Lashon Hara. That's what that dibur means. Azhara lemekabel lashon hara uledayan, and there's another azhara included. Shelo yishma divrei baldin ad sheyavo baldin chavero. Surely the dayan, when he was in Cheder, he learned the Ten Commandments, and he learned Lo Tisa, and he learned the Rashi and the Gemara on Lo Tisa, and he knows you're not allowed to do that. How does the situation even arise? Asks the Netziv. Even before that, and the Sefer HaMitzvos of the Rambam, she is hira shofet shelo lishmoa divrei echad mibaalei din shelo bifnei bal dino. In Lo Tisa, in this commandment of the Ten Commandments, we see that a shofet, a judge, is not allowed to listen to the words of one before the other one gets there. And the reason is, v'zir ha-shofet mishmar tamadvarim kedei shelo tikanes lenafsho tzura en yoshela velo amitut. Notice those words; they're very, very important. Tikanes lenafsho and tzura, because it gets into his soul. What he hears first. Here you've got first impressions and first assumptions. What you hear first penetrates your soul. And it's a tzura. There's a picture of it. Once there's a picture in your soul, you'll never escape it. You can't get away from that. My father used to tell me that he saw the Nazis march into Lithuania just before he left. And it was one of the regrets of his entire life that he saw them march into Lithuania, because he said it was impressive beyond words. And he could never remove that sense of deep impression of, wow, just look at this. He could never get rid of that, despite what they did afterwards, despite the entire Holocaust. It's Yom HaShoah. We know what we're talking about with this. He could never get that out of his mind, because he had that impression before the Holocaust. Once you've got an impression, you can't get that out of your mind. It's tikanes lenafsho tzura. Once you've got the tzura, once you've got a form in your mind, that's it. There's a picture in your mind. That's why first impressions are so powerful. How did it happen then? Says the Merumei Soda, says the Netziv. Surely he knows the Chumash. V'nireh d'mayri b'mesaper ma'aseh l'dayan. V'lo amar sherotzeh l'adunim chavero. He meets the dayan one day in the supermarket, and he corners him, and he tells him a story, with no mention of an intention to appear for him before a case. He just tells him, you know what happened? I was talking to so-and-so, and this happened, and the dayan says, that's not right. He says, no, it's not really right. And then he appears before him in a case. V'zeu ar-mimut, and that's the orma. That's the deceit in that he uses. He understands the power of that surah that the Rambam talks about, the tikanes benafsho, and he inserts the surah into the nefesh of the dayan before the dayan even comes to the case. That you can embed a picture in a person's mind. That's the power you've got. And you've got it with yourself as well. You can embed a picture in your mind that you'll never get rid of. You can embed a picture in another person's mind that they'll never get rid of. And that's what this means over here. And the Ralbag explains it further on a posuk in Mishle. Tzaddik harishon berivo. The first one who comes with an argument is the tzaddik. He starts off with an advantage. Uvar re'ehu v'chakaro. And then the friend comes and he puts a second side to it, and now the judge gives him a rough time and cross-examines him and questions him, because now he's already got a first assumption. Once you've got a first assumption, everything else is challenging the first assumption. And that's not fair on the second one. Says the Metzudas David, Ki yuchal atim dvarav ulachnis belev, ulachnisam belev, the first one who comes, can make his words sound good and insert them, embed them into the heart of the dayan. And the other person hasn't been there yet. And there's a beautiful Ralbag on that pasuk, where the Ralbag explains the same idea and says, Ki ze yeh siba al shetiyeh da'ato yoter krova el mi sheyishma dvarav barishona. One's mind is going to be closer to the first person's viewpoint. And it's going to be very difficult, if at all possible, to undo that. And that's why the din in the Aseret Adibra says, don't ever do that. Don't put yourself in a situation where you're getting a tzuro, you're getting a picture embedded into your mind, which can affect your clarity of thinking. It can give you a blind spot from which you can't remove yourself. When Reb Chaim Shmulevitz used to explain this piece of Gemara, Reb Chaim Shmulevitz was from the school of Reb Shimon Shkopsa. Even in his learning, in his lomdus, there was always a psychological element. To understand, that was Reb Shimon's big chiddush, that you have to understand the halachas of Choshen Mishpat and Even Oezer, at least those halachas with human psychology, because they don't make sense without human psychology. Chaim Shmulevitz used to do that in his Gemara shiurim, but also in his Shmuz. And when he used to learn this Gemara, he used to link it to the Gemara in Eruvin, which we referenced in a recent Shabbos morning Medrash shiur, where the Gemara says, Rabbi Abba says in the name of Shmuel, why do we paskin like Beis Hillel instead of Beis Shammai? Why are they better? We know Beis Shammai were smarter than Beis Hillel. Their Torah was more sharp. Why do we paskin like Beis Hillel? So the Gemara says, they were flexible and agile and humble. And they used to learn not only their own opinions, they used to study the view of Beit Shammai, to study the viewpoint of your opponent. And then the Gemara adds on, and this is what Reb Chaim would emphasize. They learned the words of Beit Shammai first. Ask Reb Chaim Shmulevitz, what's the addition here? We've already said you learn Beit Shammai. What difference does it make which one you learn first? Says Reb Chaim Shmulevitz, based on this Gemara, based on the Ralbag, based on the Rambam in Sefer HaMitzvahs. What they wanted to be sure is that their first impression is Beit Shammai's. Their first assumption is Beit Shammai's. And then they would work with it to see whether they can move off Beit Shammai's position. But they don't start with their own position. Because once you start with your own position, it's almost impossible to move off your own position. So what are you meant to do? This is now something that affects everything in your learning. How do you avoid learning a piece of Gemara? You learn it the first time round, you learn it B'kiyas no matter what. You start learning it the first time, you learn it through, you read it through, you've got all sorts of false impressions in your mind. How do you get beyond that? Impressions as a child, you learned Bible stories, you learned Sipurei Tanakh, they're stuck in your mind. How do you get beyond that and understand it al pi Chazal and undo what you learned as a child? How do you do that? How do you get beyond that? How do you, in a conversation with a friend or with a colleague or with an opponent, how do you get to the point where you're not tied to your own? In a relationship with a wife or a husband, how do you get to a point where you can say, sorry, I'm wrong. I made a mistake. I thought it was this, I'm wrong. How do you get to that? It's very hard. That's why it's so hard to admit mistake. Is because admitting mistake means moving off an assumption which is embedded into your thinking and into your heart and into your nefesh, as the Rambam says. To say I made a mistake, how do you uproot that out of your nefesh? Says Rabbi Yochanan, Ein Divrei Torah. You'll see that I've broken this sugya up into different pieces, and I've marked each one with a little arrow, rather than learning the whole sugya, so that you can see the structure of the sugya. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Ein Divrei Torah mitkaimin, Torah only works with you, only sticks with you, if you can make yourself as if you don't exist. Now that the Baalei Mussar talk about that a lot, what that means, the humility, that Anochi Afar Ve'efer. But the important thing is the Maharal adds a word, and I don't know whether he had it as a girsa in his Gemara or he just adds it as a perush. Eino Yodea, Kamish Eino Yodea, he adds. Make yourself like somebody who doesn't know anything. And I told you how my Rosh Hashiva, Eliyahu Mishkovsky, used to learn a piece of Gemara that he'd seen 1,000,000 times before, like a child who's never seen it before. Make yourself Kamisha Eino Yodeh. You're having a conversation with your wife or with your husband or with your children. Don't be pompous. I've got all the answers. I've thought this out. I've seen all the Meforshim. I know the Shulchan Aruch. It's very off-putting to anybody else, and it's completely destructive to yourself because you've just destroyed curiosity. And with curiosity, you've capped your imagination. You just can't go any further. You've got it. You know it. You've heard it. You've seen the bottom line. Says Rabbi Yochanan, make yourself kemi she'eino yodea. Always be an eino yodea. Always be somebody as if you've never seen this before. And you're looking at it with childlike curiosity. Shnema v'chokhmah me'ayin timtza. That's the meaning of the pasuk of v'chokhmah me'ayin timtza. You'll find wisdom if you come at it from a place of eini yodea. That's what ayin means. I don't know anything. Let me probe it. Let me analyze it. Let me go deep into it because I don't know anything. It's the most powerful phrase in the world. I don't know anything. If we can get ourselves to the level of humility to be able to recognize that before you read an article, before you study a paper, before you read a Gemara, before you do Shnayim Mikra Vecha Targum for Shabbos, before you learn a Medrash, if you can get yourself to Eini Yodea, I know nothing. Now is my opportunity to discover the things that I don't know. But if I come to it with what I do know, I'm totally limited and boxed into preconceived ideas from which I can never escape. And this is the way we train ourselves in learning Torah, and through that training in learning Torah, we train ourselves in our lives to be able to develop that capacity of Eini Yodea and to learn things from that perspective.